Hello and welcome to the Kant Academy's Year 8 lessons about the suffragettes for this week. Last week you did your introduction by looking at the suffragists and the suffragettes. So you should have already also completed a starter activity as part of your team's live introduction this week. And remember that whilst you're working through, you need to make sure that you pause the video where I ask you to in order to complete the tasks. Now remember also that your teachers are available on Teams for the entire lesson if you have any questions or things you'd like to share. Your teachers will also request that you come back at the end of the lesson to share your thoughts. So first of all, Year 8, could I ask you to get down today's title, please? Did Emily Davison intend to die for the vote? Remember that if your book is in school, you should be working on paper today, and make sure that you keep all of your work safe so that you can hand it in when we return to school. Now also, if you need a bit of time to get this title down, pause the video now so you can do that. Before we start looking at today's content, I'd like us just to have a think about this key word that's going to pop up a few times today, and the word is martyr. Now you may or may not have heard of this word before, but we're going to be thinking today about whether Emily Davison was a martyr. Now, first of all, I would recommend that you write down the word martyr into your books and the definition. You can find that just here on the PowerPoint, look. So martyr equals a person who is prepared to die for their beliefs. A martyr can be anybody who is just prepared to die for whatever beliefs they feel are important. In this case, we're going to be looking at whether Emily Davison was so determined for women to have the right to vote that she was prepared to die for those beliefs. So before we move on, can you pause the video again and write down the definition for a martyr in your books? So for this slide, Year 8, you don't actually need to write anything down. You can if you'd like to. I'm just letting you know it's not a requirement at this stage. You are going to be making a lot more notes later in the lesson about who Emily Davison was and what happened to her. But this is just an overall introduction, so you can just listen carefully to this rather than making notes. So to start off, guys, Emily Davison was born in Blackheath in South East London in October 1872. Now, she actually studied at the Royal Holloway College and Oxford University, despite the fact that at this time women were not allowed to take degrees, but it does tell us that she was quite well educated. In 1906, she decided to join the WSPU, which, as we know from last week, was the suffragettes, and it was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst. 3 years later, after joining the WSPU, she decided to give up her job as a teacher, and she decided to work full-time for the suffrage movement. This tells us that she was incredibly committed to the cause and she wanted to dedicate a lot of time to it. She was actually seen frequently causing public disturbance throughout her time at the WSPU, so for example burning post boxes, and because of her public disturbance she did spend a number of short periods in jail. In 1909 she was actually sentenced to a month's hard labour in Strangeways prisons in Manchester after she'd been thrown rocks at the carriage of the Chancellor, David Lloyd George. So again, we can see that she was quite committed to performing some of the more violent acts of the suffragettes to gain attention from the media and the government. And whilst in prison, remember that suffragettes quite often did go on hunger strike, and Emily Davison was somebody that participated in this. She attempted to starve herself whilst she was in prison, and she even tried to resist force feeding, although that would have been incredibly difficult. And by 1911, Davison was known to have become increasingly militant, determined in the cause and willing to actually perform some quite dangerous acts to basically gain more attention from the media and the government for women's rights to vote. On the 4th of June 1913, she is known to have run out in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby. Her purpose was unclear, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. She was trampled on by the horse, and she died on the 8th of June from her injury. So she actually spent quite a bit of time in intensive care in hospital where she was suffering with her injuries and she was in a coma. But she did die from her injuries a few days after the event. Now what this tells us is, of course, that Davison was a woman that was very committed to the WSPU. She was committed to the cause of gaining women's rights to vote, and she was willing to participate in some of the more dangerous and violent acts of the movement. But what this tells us is that she did die as a result of one of the events in which she was involved. But what we don't know for sure is whether she intended to become a martyr for the cause. Did she intend to die at the Epsom Derby that day? And that's what we're going to be looking at in more detail for today's lesson. Okay guys, so your first task that you're going to need to complete today is a comprehension task. It's a little bit similar to what we did last week, where we were looking through some information and I asked you to answer some questions along the way. This time we're going to be reading an account of what actually happened to Emily Davison from the view of somebody that saw her that day at the Epsom Derby. I've broken the text down over 3 different slides so that you can read each section and complete the relevant questions underneath them. So for example, we're going to start with this first bit of text just here. You're going to need to read through this on your own, and then I'd like you to answer question 1 using that information. The first question is, why do you think Mary Richardson, who was the author of this text, the person that had seen Emily Davison that day, why do you think she got scornful looks when she was at the Epsom Derby on the same day she saw Emily? I'm going to leave you with this, guys, so that you can have a go at completing the activity. And remember to pause the slide so that you can complete this at your own pace. Okay guys, so you should have already completed question 1 using the eyewitness account from Mary Richardson, who was there on the same day that Emily Davison had died. Now you've also got to now answer questions 2, 3 and 4, and all of the information that you need to answer those questions is in this section here. You don't need to look anywhere else. Remember to please make sure that these answers are in full sentences. That means using the question as part of your sentence and then completing it with detail from the information. Remember that you will need to look back over this information, so you need to make sure it makes sense when you read it back. Next lesson this week, you are going to be doing an extended piece of writing, and you will want to look back at your notes to help you with it. So make sure that you do write in full sentences and make sure that you use good detail. And at this stage, I would now like you to pause the slide again so that you can complete questions 2, 3 and 4 at your own pace. Okay guys, so we're just going to continue with our comprehension. There are 7 questions in total. So you've now got to answer questions 5 and 6. And again, you're just using the information above the questions just here. Remember to make sure that you're writing in full sentences again, and then you've got 1 more question on the next slide. So pause this one again and complete the next 2 questions. Okay guys, we're now on our final question of comprehension, question 7. So for this one, you do just need to use the bit of information just above the question here. But the question this time is, why do you think the man hit Mary across the face with the suffragette paper? Now the text here does tell you about the fact that Mary was hit across the face with the paper that she was holding in her hand, which was the suffragette paper, and a man hit her across the face with it. I want you to think about why that happened. So why do you think a man would hit Mary across the face with suffragette paper after this had happened to Emily Davison at the race course? Now, first of all, guys, can you make sure that you do again answer this one in full sentences? Also, if you're a bit unsure about any of these 7 questions that I've asked you to complete, of course, you can ask your teachers any questions that you've got on Teams, but if you want to just double check your answers and make sure that you've got them all right, if you go to the end of this YouTube video, you will find me just talking through the 7 answers. You don't have to listen to the answers if you think you've got them all right and you're 100% certain, but if you're a bit unsure and you just want to check to make sure that you've got all the information correct, then of course, feel free to go to the end of the PowerPoint and check your answers. You can do it now or at the end of the lesson. But for now, guys, pause the video and let's complete this final comprehension question. You are now going to watch a video analysis of the event. You're going to need to find this by finding the link on YouTube in the description box for this video, or you can find it on Show My Homework. Either one is fine, it's the exact same link. I'd like to click on that link, watch the video, and write down some thoughts of your own. So after watching that video, you might have a pretty good idea now about whether you think Emily intended to die for the vote or not. But we're going to find out a bit more about this through a source investigation. Before we start this, could I ask that you just make a chart on your piece of paper or in your books? So you're going to need to do 1 line down and 1 line across. Obviously much neater than mine, because I hope you'll have a ruler. And then on one side, the title needs to be points supporting she did intend to die. And then on the other side, you need to have points supporting that she didn't intend to die. So basically, you're going to create this chart, and then over the next few slides, I'm going to be showing you some sources that you can look at. And each one needs to be placed on either side of the chart. So for example, if the source tells you some evidence that she did intend to die, then you would write down your evidence in here. If you thought that actually the evidence suggests that she didn't intend to die, you need to write down your evidence in there. You may want to also make a note of which source it is. So for example, you might say source A tells me that, and you would write down what source A tells you about whether she did or didn't intend to die. We're going to do the first one together on the next slide. You might want to stop this one here so that you can make your chart. Okay guys, so we're going to do source A together, as I just mentioned, so you can watch this carefully and then you can place in some notes into your charts as we talk through this first one. So source A is a picture of the racecourse and it tells us that Emily Davison is fatally injured after being trampled by Anma, that's the king's horse. Pictures show that Davison ran onto the course and stood sideways waiting for the king's horse to come by. Now, for me, I think the fact that the source mentions that she stood sideways and also the fact that she was waiting for the king's horse in particular kind of confirms what the video was saying about the fact that she was intending to do something else, not necessarily to actually die. I think that the fact that she stood sideways perhaps shows she is not intending to run straight out in front of the horse, otherwise she would have stood straight in front of it. The fact that she stood sideways suggests that she's actually got intentions to do something to the king's horse as a publicity stunt. And of course, kind of, as it said in the video, mistimed how fast a racehorse is moving. The fact that she's also waiting for the king's horse, and I know that even if she was intending to die for the course, I suppose she might still target the king's horse, but I still think that by targeting the king's horse it shows that again she's trying to perform some sort of publicity stunt. She's trying to do something to the king's horse, and as the video stated, she was holding a Vote Women scarf that perhaps she was intending to pin to the king's horse so that when he went through the finishing line his horse was essentially dressed with a Vote Women banner, and that would have been a huge publicity stunt and would have been in all the papers. So I think this source, I would place that in that she did not intend to die, because I think that this is telling us that Davison actually ran onto the course standing sideways with intentions to do something to the king's horse as opposed to actually kill herself. So that's source A done together. What I'd like you guys to do is work through the next few slides and pause them so that you can add them into either the did or did not intend to die sections, and at the end of this task I'll be asking you what your overall views are. Okay guys, so this is your source B. This one's quite a long one and it's about Emily's past and about like some of the things that she'd done throughout her life, some of the things that we actually talked about at the beginning of the lesson. I'd like to read this carefully and tell me whether it suggests that she did or did not intend to die by making some notes in your chart. And then again, moving on to the next source. Pause this slide for now and complete this one. Okay, now we've got sources C and D. What I'd like you to do is read through these and again add them to your chart, year 8. Pause the slide again here so that you can complete this one. Now you've got source E. This one is from Emmeline Pankhurst's story, and again it's quite a long text, but I'd like you to read it carefully and pick out some points about whether she did or did not intend to die based on this information. Now you've got sources F and G. Again, these ones will give you some information about Emily Davison and whether she did or did not intend to die. Make some notes in your chart, pause the slide here so that you can do that. Okay guys, this is your last source, source H, but this one is from other piece of information to consider, which means it's from a collection of sources. So for example, some of the bullet points you might find go in the did intend to die section, and some of the bullet points you might think go in the did not intend to die section. That's fine. Please read each bullet point separately and place them in the correct side of your chart. And what I'd like to do, guys, is pause the slide here for a second whilst you complete that source. Okay, now what I'd like you to do, year 8, is to have a think about all of the different pieces of information that you've looked at today. So we've looked at interpretations of the event through the video, we've looked at different sources and bits of information from people at the time and historians, and we're thinking now about what our thoughts are on whether or not Emily intended to die for the vote. Now for this one, I'd like you to have a think about this on your own or chat to somebody at home about it if you've got some time to do that. And then what I'd like to do is come back onto Teams and go to the question and answer box and tell your teacher whether you think Emily did or did not intend to die for the vote. Now you can say, yes, I do, and you've got to explain why. Or you can say, no, I do not think she intended to die because, and then explain why. So make sure you make it clear what your view is, but also give a brief explanation to your teacher too. I'm going to stop here now, guys. This is the end of your lesson and the end of your content for today. So well done for all of the work you've completed so far. And next lesson, we're going to be doing an extended piece of writing about this information. Now, again, if you're unsure about the answers for the comprehension questions, you can keep watching this video. But if you're happy with the comprehension questions, you can stop it here. Thank you very much for listening, Year 7, and take care. Okay then, Year 8, so these next few slides, we're just going to go through the answers for the comprehension questions. Only go through this if you're feeling like you need to. You can have already stopped the video if you're happy with your comprehension answers. But for question 1, I asked you, why do you think Mary Davison got scornful looks? You needed to have mentioned something in your answer about the fact that she had taken out a copy of the Suffragette, which was basically a newspaper that was basically from the suffragettes about the suffrage movement, and therefore, again, by waving that around, you're kind of demonstrating that you're supportive of the suffrage movement, and that was something that was quite unpopular for many at the time. And so people were kind of giving her scornful looks for being a woman that supported the cause. And this isn't something that men necessarily felt. There were lots and lots of women in England that were equally kind of disgusted in women for behaving in the way that they were, in terms of like campaigning and, you know, marching for women's rights. Is something that was considered unpopular amongst some men and women in the country. So please don't assume that all women were suffragettes or that all women believed that women deserved the right to vote. There were many women in the country that would have looked at a woman with a suffragette paper and given her scornful looks. So that's basically why she received those looks, and you needed to have mentioned something about that. Okay, guys, so for the next question, question 2, why was Mary surprised to see Emily at the races? And this is largely about the fact that it's kind of what she'd formed as an opinion of her previous to this event. So, for example, Mary talks about the fact that she had formed an opinion that Emily was a very serious-minded person, and that's why she felt surprised to see her at the races, because she was not the sort of woman spend the afternoon there. So as long as you mention something about that, about the fact that Emily was not the kind of woman that would be seen spending her days at the races, because she was quite serious-minded, and therefore Mary was surprised to see her. Question 3, where in the crowd was Emily stood? So it does mention the fact that she was stood close to the white painted rails where the course bends round at Tattenham Corner. So that's what you needed to mention in the sense of where she was stood. And number 4, how does Mary describe Emily's behaviour at the races? So there's a couple of things you could have mentioned for that. So, for example, it talks about how beautifully calm her face was, and the fact that she was actually looking quite absorbed and kind of interested in what she was doing. She wasn't really interested in what was going on around her. So what I think you needed to have mentioned is that Emily was absorbed with her own thoughts. She wasn't interested in what was going on around her, and she seemed to look beautifully calm. Whether that was because she was intending to die and she believed that that was the right thing to do and she was satisfied with her decision and therefore felt calm in that choice, or was it that actually she was about to head onto the race course to do something else? Was she not intending to die, and therefore that's why she looked beautifully calm at this stage? So they're the next few answers that you should have got down. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, guys, so question 5 then we're going to look at now. Did Emily intend to harm the jockey? And the answer is no. She'd actually stated that no one else would be injured in this event, not even the jockey. Okay, so that's important for that one. Number 6, what happened as Emily stepped onto the race course? For this bit here, it says that she slipped under the rail, ran into the middle of the race course, which actually is quite different to what we saw in the video. It wasn't really the middle. I think she was more at the side, isn't she? It's all over so quickly. It says that Emily had fallen under the hooves of one of the horses and it seemed to have been hurled for some distance across the grass, and then she lay very still. So in terms of what happened to Emily once she stepped onto the race course, they're the few key points that you could use to help you answer that question. Okay, guys, so the last question, question 7, I asked you, why do you think the man hit Mary across the face? You might have come up with different things for this. For me, and what my opinion is that I think he kind of hits Mary across the face to tell her to wake up. It's obviously his opinion that the suffrage movement was dangerous for some women, and he kind of believes that Emily Davison has been harmed as a result of the actions of campaigning for women's rights to vote. And so by her holding up a suffrage paper, I think he's kind of calling her a silly woman for being involved in this. And by slapping her across the face, he's trying to tell her to wake up and see the dangers of what kind of comes from being involved in this. Of course, Emily Davison wasn't dead at the scene. It was clear that she was suffering some really extreme injuries and could possibly die from these injuries. And so I suppose he's clearly against the effects or the impact of this movement. So I think I would mention something about that. But of course, if you've mentioned something different and you think he hit her around the face for a different reason, share it with your teacher perhaps on Teams, or tell us when you get back in school. I would like to hear what your thoughts are. But that brings us to the end of our answers to the comprehension questions. I hope you feel confident now that we've gone through them, and I will speak to you all again soon. Take care.